Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our February monthly webinar. My name is Tegan Wilmot, and I serve as your Education and Prevention Manager here at NASMA. Please do say hello in the chat and share with us where you are joining us from. And then our webinar today is titled Green Crab Invasion, Coastal Perspectives, and it's being co-hosted with Sea Grant. Before we begin, I'd like to share a little bit about NASMA for those of you that don't know us well. NASMA, the North American Invasive Species Management Association, is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to empower invasive species management in North America. We are here to serve members in the professional and academic world who work on invasive species. We have 18 board members and 10 active committees who support our programming. We have 8 team members and over 800 members. And we communicate with over 15,000 subscribers and interact with over 38,000 social media followers. And during big events like National Invasive Species Awareness Week and Play Clean Go Awareness Week, we were able to extend that reach to over 2.9 million people last year. So what do we do? NASMA provides the connection, the tools, and the voice you need to address invasive species. We frame our programs around these core pillars. We work hard to provide opportunities for collaboration and connection through our webinars, summits, and annual conference. We provide a collective voice on a national platform to advocate for relevance and support through our Government Relations Program and National Invasive Species Awareness Week. And we equip our membership with the tools needed to manage and educate the public about invasive species through Play Clean Go, the NASMA Shop, our Certified Weed-Free Products Program, Mapping Data Standards, and NASMA Academy. We are very excited to be hosting National Invasive Species Awareness Week next week from February 24th through the 28th. This year, we will be offering our virtual webinar series, and this is a great opportunity to be part of a collective voice to advocate for support for invasive species legislation. This year's theme is Enhancing North American Biosecurity to Protect Against Invasive Species. Please visit our website to learn more or to get involved with this event. We have a great webinar schedule posted on the website, so I encourage you to register today. And you will not want to miss the 2025 NASMA Annual Conference. You want to mark your calendar and plan to join over 300 attendees in Lake Tahoe from November 3rd through the 6th. Our theme this year is Charting a New Course. And we have some great speakers lined up already and hope to see you there. You can register today by visiting our conference webpage. And as a friendly reminder, your membership dues do help fund our educational programs like this webinar. And if you're not currently a member, we offer a variety of different options. You can view our new membership structure on our website at nasma.org. We also offer a Premier Partner Program for organizations that wish to support our work. And our Premier Partners enjoy benefits throughout the year, including acknowledgement on our website, at events, and more. All right, and to get us started, I'm going to introduce you to Tim Campbell with Wisconsin Sea Grant, who has helped us to organize this event. Tim is the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Manager for the University of Wisconsin Sea Grant Program and the National AIS Liaison for the NOAA Sea Grant Program. He supports AIS prevention outreach, communications, and program evaluation, and works to apply university and Sea Grant resources to AIS issues. And he's been with Wisconsin Sea Grant since 2011. All right, and I'm going to let Tim take it away from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Tegan, and thank you all for joining us today. So I guess just to get started, I wanted to share a little bit about who Sea Grant is and what we do and why we might be interested in working with NASMA on a webinar like this. So Sea Grant is a collection of 34 mostly university-based programs responsible for helping communities with the responsible and sustainable use of Great Lakes and ocean resources through education, research, and outreach. It's a federal-state partnership where both entities work together to house these Sea Grant programs that help communities address coastal issues that impact them. And from an invasive species perspective, green crabs are really interesting, not something that I necessarily thought I'd be working with out of Wisconsin Sea Grant, but through my national role have been able to tune in some different non-Great Lakes issues. And green crabs are really interesting because when you look at how they're established across the country, you have places like on the East Coast where they've been well established for 200 plus years, and we're thinking more about resource utilization and helping communities maybe recover what has been lost by the invasion. And then as you move over to the West Coast, you're still early in that invasion curve, so you're looking at early detection, rapid response, and in the case of Alaska, what like the very initial response and populations might look like. So I think it's really interesting to see all the different needs that communities have when managing this species, and happy that we have a couple of sea grant programs and community partners in Alaska working on these issues that are going to share a little bit about that today. Another thing that if you're really interested in a whole bunch more about European green crab management, the ANS Task Force recently approved, and by recently, I guess, 2023, so in the grand scheme of things recently, approved an updated management plan for European green crabs. And I'll be sure to put the link to that in the chat so you can check it out after your interest has been piqued about all this different green crab management work. So at that, I don't want to take a ton of time from our speakers. So we'll move on to our presentations for today. Next slide, please. So our webinar today, the Green Crab Invasion, Coastal Perspectives, we have Gabby Bratt from New Hampshire Sea Grant, Emily Grayson from Washington Sea Grant, and Ian Hudson from the Metlakatla Indian Community to share a little bit about kind of the different ways that they're working with green crabs in their communities. Next slide. And so just to introduce Gabby quickly and her presentation, the New Hampshire Green Crab Project, working on solutions to tame an invader. Gabby is a fisheries and aquaculture extension specialist for New Hampshire Sea Grant and the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension. Her programming and research is centered around seafood marketing, market creation, and consumer education and awareness about New Hampshire's fisheries, aquaculture, and local seafood accessibility. Gabby received her PhD in zoology from the University of New Hampshire in 2005. And she, since 2011, has been involved in fisheries and aquaculture research and outreach. So this, hand it over to Gabby. And I guess for our speakers, as a reminder, it sounds like we all have 15 minutes. I'll pop on the screen, right before 15 minutes. And Tegan said that if it gets really serious, she'll also pop on the screen as well to make sure that we stay on time. So thanks, Gabby.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. Like Tim said, I'm Gabby Bratt. I'm the Fisheries Extension Specialist for New Hampshire Sea Grant and UNH Cooperative Extension. And I have also not thought that green crabs was going to be a big career move for me. I got my PhD in baby squids and other aquaculture things, not necessarily green crabs. But through my work with our fishing industry here in New Hampshire, green crabs sort of floated across, no pun intended, my workspace. And here we are. So for the last, I guess, 10 years now, I've been working on things to do with this invader here in New Hampshire. We created the New Hampshire Green Crab Project back in 2015 as a result of an inquiry by one of our lobster fishermen. But just to begin, I wanted to assume that not everybody knows everything about European green crabs. So the first couple of slides are going to be a little intro and some tidbits about this invader. The European green crab, or Carcinus manus, is a native to the Atlantic coast of Europe and northern Africa. And it came from Europe in ballast water, and it was first detected in New England waters in the early 1800s, and since then has successfully invaded the US East Coast and into Canada. In the 1980s, we also saw a second invasion on the US West Coast. And it is on both the USDA and US Fish and Wildlife's most wanted invasive species lists. Hold on. So did you know that green crabs are really good invaders because they are found and they like to live in a variety of different habitats, including protected rocky shores, cobble, beaches, sand flats, and tidal marshes. And they have a wide tolerance for different temperature ranges and salinities. They can live 4 to 7 years, which, is quite a lot for an invertebrate as far as I know. And they are very, very good at establishing new populations in new spaces very quickly. And a result of that, the result of being so quick at establishing themselves is that they have a dramatic impact on the resident native species and the diversity. They are mean and they are voracious predators and especially deadly for all the things that we like to eat, such as clams and oysters and so on. Just for an example, one crab can consume 40 half-inch clams per day, and crabs its own size. Additionally, we call green crabs ecosystem engineers, and it's not necessarily a positive in this case, and being an excellent invader is not always a good thing either. In my opinion, they are almost indestructible. I have kept them in my refrigerator for weeks as soft shell crabs, and they don't eat, and yet they're still mean and quite active even a few weeks after being in my fridge. They can tolerate a wide range of conditions, including being left out of water. They are able to collect droplets of water in their gills, so they do stay perfectly viable in dry spaces. And again, they have a wide range of salinities and temperatures that they can survive in. They can also learn. They are highly adaptive and they improve prey handling skills as well. So if they can't eat one thing, they will go after something else that can provide just as much nutrition. They are aggressive, and one of the reasons they are considered ecosystem engineers is because they can and do burrow and dig as they look for different prey. As a result of that, they perturb bottom substrates and so on, causing instability in these environments. Additionally, in areas with green crabs, it has been shown that biodiversity of the different species that inhabit those same spaces dramatically declines. They like to clip eelgrass beds or other salt marsh grasses and disrupt a lot of shellfish beds, not just disrupt, but actually completely destroy and decimate a lot of shellfish beds and populations. In essence, they are ecologically and economically very, very expensive to deal with. And in the East Coast, we have been dealing with them for quite a long time. So a little bit about the East Coast green crab invasion history. I'll play my little fun video here. The first reports of European green crabs on the Atlantic coast of the US were reported in 1817 on the New Jersey and Maryland coasts, and they went on to spread north and south to Cape Cod and into the Canadian Maritimes, as well as down into Delaware and to their most southern extent, Virginia. The expansion into Canada occurred around the early 1990s and has since continued. I actually meant to put another map on here showing where they have them in Eastern Canada, and they have certainly moved up into Newfoundland and further north here in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick area. Interestingly, though, the expansion into Nova Scotia, into Gulf of St. Lawrence, seems to be the introduction of a genetically distinct green crab, in that they're probably from a Scandinavian origin. And both the crabs that invaded in the early 1800s here in the US and the ones that have come in the 90s in Canada seem to be hybridizing. There is evidence that these crabs are even more hardy, meaning that they can take over much more quickly, and we have an even harder time getting rid of them. And not only are they more hardy, but they are also meaner. So mitigation efforts are, going to be a little bit harder there as well. So the East Coast, we've had about 200 and something years to deal with these pests. And so what have we been up to in all of that time? Well, up until recently, within the last decade or so, not a whole heck of a lot. We've known that European green crabs are a problem. We have seen evidence of significant economic damage to shellfish industry, especially up in Maine. However, what we've done is sort of in these fits and starts with looking into mitigation measures. But to date, no state has actually succeeded in implementing any long-lasting measures. So a lot of what has prompted sort of a new resurgence into looking at what we can do about the green crabs is the loss of millions and millions of dollars for the shellfish industry in Maine and other fisheries. And, so money talks, you're losing money. So let's start looking into this so we can put a stop to those, stem those losses. Federal government has really done very little for the East Coast, and it's very likely because we're seen as a lost cause. We've had them for 200 years and we haven't gotten rid of them. So it is lucky, though, that the West Coast has had some access to funding as they are in the quote unquote early stages of the invasion. And, the idea is if you can catch them early, you can definitely, hopefully, mitigate much better and manage it in a much better way. Unfortunately, the problem on the East Coast, just because we didn't deal with it, doesn't mean that it went away. It's actually gotten worse. And as surface ocean temperatures warm, et cetera, that means that our harsh winters are not keeping them at bay, so to speak. They are not overwintering. I mean, they're still active. Maybe right now, this February, they've slowed down a little bit. But when I first started this work, we were still seeing cold enough winters that activity of green crabs in the winter went way down and they actually would die off a little bit, but we do not have those winters anymore. So they live longer, they forage longer, they reproduce longer during the year. So our numbers are exploding. And essentially, this is sort of what brought me into this space. Like I said, millions of dollars are lost for our fisheries. And particularly in New Hampshire, we are a predominantly lobster fishery here. And our lobstermen were complaining that they were losing money and bait and time just dealing with these crabs getting into their traps. And they said, well, can you help? There's no market, I can't sell them, and I don't want them in my traps anymore. So that is how I got thrown into it. And that was the start of the New Hampshire Green Crab Project in 2015. The idea behind this project is that it is a multi-pronged initiative that uses research and outreach and extension to address several aspects of this species. Part of it has to do with monitoring. Where are they? When do they show up? How many are there? And all of those baseline information, things that we've had, but that needed to be updated. In particular, because I am in fisheries and this was to help the lobster fishery, I was looking at monitoring these crabs in a different way, primarily trying to figure out when crabs are in their pre-molt phases or in the process of molting, with the idea of potentially investigating the feasibility of creating markets in a fishery for this species. So that leads me into sort of the investigation aspect of things for the fishery. Could it happen? Could we have something similar like the blue crab fishery in the South? And so on. And could we have a successful enough quote unquote fishery and use it as a strategy for population control or even eradication of this species? That was slightly naive, but we can get into that a little bit later. Also work with the fishing industry and regulatory agencies, if possible, to develop a fishery and demand for a market for soft-shell green crabs, again, similar to the soft-shell blue crab markets that we see down south of the United States. And then this required academic and in-the-field research to look at peak molting periods and whether we could figure out when we could tell that these crabs would be molting. Do they have any morphological physical indicators that would tell us, yep, these crabs are about to molt and we need to harvest them and put them aside, wait for molting to occur and, put them on your plate. So the monitoring component of the New Hampshire Green Crab Project, we created something called the Great Green Crab Hunt. This is a great program in terms of outreach, education, extension, and just inclusivity. It is a participatory science field-based program. And essentially, it is monitoring coastal areas in New Hampshire and southern New England, southern Maine, and northern Massachusetts. Monitoring occurs from April to October. We use a mobile app called Anecdata, which allows for wide coverage and consistent in-the-field data collection, but it is also an open platform data collection tool. So the data that collected through Anecdata is available upon request by anyone. And the beauty of the Great Green Crab Hunt is that it includes citizens of all ages and spaces. They are trained on how to identify green crabs, what to look for, where to find them, and what to do with them once you collect them, and also how to use the app. We hold official hunts, quote unquote, once per month during the field season, which again is from April to October. And the hope is that once our participants in the official Great Green Crab hunts are trained and comfortable, they are already part of our community and can contribute on their own year round. So anytime they're out on the coast, they can pull up the app and start doing this protocol on their own. It is not quite as in detail or as strict in terms of data collection as a protocol from NOAA, for example. We need to remember that these are citizen scientists, participatory scientists, and they are volunteering their time. So really extensive, in-depth protocols just don't work quite as well. So part of the work that we've been doing with the Great Green Crab Hunt is we've been collecting these data since 2019, once we ironed out certain things. And we have been able to really get a very interesting look at sort of molting patterns and male-female dynamics in the New Hampshire area, especially on the coast and in our estuaries. The very interesting thing is that while I know that there's a ton of soft shells, finding them has been interesting and a little bit harder. But we certainly have had a lot of success in finding hotspots for the hard shell crabs, pretty much whenever we get started in April all the way through even November. Part of the reason our field season's kind of truncated and not year round is just because it's really, really cold and access to a lot of our spaces and beaches and coastal areas become difficult. So the other aspects of the New Hampshire Green Crab Project is essentially what I have been speaking about before, and it is outreach and education, but really trying to figure out what to do with all of this biomass, all of these crabs, that have had no traditional markets. They have really very little meat. They're kind of a pain to deal with, not only when they're alive, but also what do you do with them once you boil them up? You can't really pick a lot of meat out of them. So really thinking about other potential markets that's not necessarily culinary, but really, if we want to make money off of it, what's the biggest bang for our effort and buck, if so, so to speak? And that would be having a soft shell crab product. And that was a lot of what my initial research was trying to just figure all of this out. When do they molt? Are they any good? Will people eat them? So there was a lot of consumer research, working with restaurants and chefs. And once we figured out how to actually even produce soft shell green crabs on our own, but also looking into things like alternative bait markets. So, can they be used as alternative bait for the lobster industry or even for aquaculture, and other uses such as compost or dog treats and food and things like that. Also, the idea behind all of this was not only can you remove biomass, but also potentially bring about some positive economic and ecological changes, serve as an alternative revenue stream for fishers, aquaculturists, and, with the idea of eat a crab, save an estuary kind of motto. And at the same time, while all of this is going on, bring in not only the public and so on, but also academics. So a lot of collaborative research, participatory science. Once we figured out how to, essentially harvest, hold, and essentially produce the soft shell crabs. I mean, that's technology. So have technology transfer applications, as well as a lot of opportunities for mentorship and for students and people in the industry, and hopefully, have some economic development, including job creation or business creation. So very quickly, since the start of this project in 2015, we have done a lot. We did not know anything at all about green crab molting, anything about anything in that sense. And we, along with some partners up in Maine and Massachusetts, we were able to sort of figure out of when molting occurs for male green crabs and female green crabs. We were able to put into place a protocol on how to harvest the green crabs, hold them until they molt, what works best for them, etc. We started the Great Green Crab Hunts, which is now in its, let's see, 6th year. It will be our 6th year doing it this spring. And we have held an International Green Crab Summit in 2018, and it seems like it should be about time to have another one. We've had tons and tons of workshops. The Maine Fishermen's Forum is a huge one up here in New England. We've created a green crab guide of how to identify them in the field and what to do, as well as it provides processing and handling of the crabs if you want to eat them. We've produced videos, we've trained interns and graduate students, worked with 10 fishermen on how to produce these soft shells, continue to develop markets and work with restaurants and chefs. We have an exhibit at one of our informal education centers and so on. We have one really cool new legitimate business he actually quit his day job and is producing and harvesting green crabs for the area. And if you hadn't heard about it, we did team up with a distillery here in New Hampshire, and we made a green crab whiskey that kind of went viral. And don't ask me how it tastes. If you're not a bourbon person, it might not be your thing. Apparently, it's very good as a Bloody Mary. And then just some of the other research that's been going on here in New England. Primarily, a lot of it has to do with understanding interactions with emerging aquaculture operations, especially here in New Hampshire, where, a lot of our oyster operators want to know, okay, are these crabs going to eat all of my seed, or can I even make money off of harvesting some of these crabs, et cetera? We continue to do a lot of intertidal monitoring surveys along the New England coast, but especially up in Maine. We have very, very sensitive eelgrass environments that seem to be collapsing in part to green crabs. So an increase in research and in sort of the interactions and effects of green crabs in eelgrass beds is going on. We've even tried to figure out how to use green crab hemolymph as a quick assay to see if they're ready to be harvested and put aside for molting without having to depend a lot on the morphological cues. That needs some ironing out, but it's been pretty interesting. But essentially, what are we doing in New England? Essentially, we're trying to figure out how to make money off of them while at the same time keep track of monitoring population levels, et cetera. We really, really, really need more people to eat them and more people from the fishing industry and the aquaculture industry to want to target the species. We have shown and are continuing to show that these are edible, good seafood products. They are, for all intents and purposes, they're sustainable. There's lots and lots and lots of them. So, eat a green crab and, give the lobsters a break and so on. And at the same time, by participating or asking for green crabs on your plate, the idea is we can outfish and overeat. So let's do a little bit of that with the green crabs. And we just, here in the Northeast, we're trying to figure out how to bust open those markets and, what are the regulatory impacts of that? How do we do that? So that's essentially what we've been working on. We will continue to be working with our West Coast and other Sea Grant programs to implement and support similar programs and efforts and address research needs. We're working hopefully to get more and more fishermen to drink the green crab whiskey / Kool-Aid and start harvesting and selling. We are working with the Sea Grant Law Center on how to figure out the regulations in each state. It is not very simple. Every state deals with invasive species and especially green crabs very differently and independently. So trying to figure out that landscape. And then more outreach events. We're definitely trying to get a green crab week started with other partners here. So maybe West Coast, you could jump in and we could have a national green crab week, which would be kind of fun. Still working up some of our green crab hunt data. That's been a really fun project, and definitely data is good to have. And like I said, we're just continuing to develop markets and alternative uses, and how do we get rid of such big biomass. That's the biggest problem, is that it's just, there's so many of them. How do we create businesses or other activities that can actually make a bigger impact on the numbers? And I think I spoke very quickly, but I think that is all for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Gabby. And definitely forgot to mention this earlier, and Jody's been mentioning it in the chat. But if you have any questions, we're going to hold questions till the end so we can make sure to get through all of our presenters. But be sure to put your questions in the Q&A. We'll try to answer them as we can or answer them verbally at the end. So moving to the West Coast, I'd like to introduce Emily Grayson. She is a marine ecologist from Washington Sea Grant, and as the lead for the crab team, she oversees a comprehensive program focused on monitoring and control of European green crabs. And Emily, I'll hand it over to give you as much time as possible.
Thanks very much, Tim. It's morning here still in Washington State, where I'm in Seattle. So good morning, everybody. Good afternoon to those who are in the afternoon portion of their day. My name is Emily Grayson, and I am the program lead, as Tim mentioned, for Crab Team, which is a program at Washington Sea Grant that supports statewide management efforts related to invasive European green crab. Today, I'm going to continue some of the themes that Gabby kicked us off on in terms of talking about specifically about community participation in the green crab effort in Washington State and how that's played a role in the greater coastwide history of green crab on the West Coast. I will also just acknowledge that, seeing as my title is a wide net and a deep bench, I want to acknowledge the deep bench that's just on the Sea Grant team. This is the current staff that we have who participate in green crab work just at Washington Sea Grant or the University of Washington, who today, a third of this crew or half of this crew is actually cutting bait for our volunteer monitors. It's our big annual bait cutting party, and the additional efforts in Washington are so much larger than could fit in this slide. I also just want to highlight that today is the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife hosted Green Crab Managers Symposium, and it's the meeting I'm switching back and forth between today with about 100 participants from around the state, keeping up to date on the research. So today I'm going to be talking about the community engagement efforts, which was really the origin of this program of Crab Team, and really kind of at the heart and soul of what Washington has been participating in with green crab. But I also want to point out that even within our own program, not only are we working with community groups to do monitoring, but the program has grown over the years alongside the actual invasion to include components that also support statewide management capacity in terms of advising managers. So we are giving talks later today at this management symposium, building technical capacity, so training folks to do trapping efforts in order to attempt to suppress populations or protect resources, and also engaging in a wide variety of applied research that has uses in either understanding or helping manage the green crab invasion. So that's all stuff I'm not going to talk about today, but I hope that it gives you a flavor for, all the types of ways that people work together on this topic. So I'm going to sort of pick up where Gabby left off. She set this stage in a really helpful way to talk about sort of the changes in green crab distribution over space and over time, and how it continues to evolve and be an emerging threat, even though it's been a species that's been present in the United States for more than 2 centuries. In terms of the global pathways of green crab spread, some of the transport has been direct from the native range, and you heard Gabby reference 2 such transport, evidence for at least 2 such transport events to the east coast of the United States. from what we know so far, there has only been a single transport event to the west coast of the United States, and that event actually came from the east coast. So this was a secondary invasion, and we have some genetic evidence that supports that. Because of this pathway, the current status and the current place that each invasion finds itself along the invasion timeline has some different characteristics that are really important to the management efforts that are ongoing, what the needs are right now, what the status is. So as you heard Gabby mention, that green crabs, having been on the East Coast for at least 200 years, they have a broad range of habitat use and genetic resources from multiple introduction events that really enables them to be particularly robust in terms of their populations. By comparison, the West Coast, as I mentioned, is the result of a single introduction event. They've only been detected and confirmed on the West Coast for roughly the last 3 decades. Relative to the East Coast, they're much more restricted to soft sediment habitats, and that it may be a function of population density and something that's starting to change even on our coast. And we only have the genetic resources from the southern lineage of the native range. So there are some characteristic differences that really have changed where we're at in terms of our management efforts, what our questions are, and how we're prioritizing management. A little bit more about the history of the West Coast arrival and spread of green crabs. As I mentioned, they were transported by humans from the eastern US and most likely arrived as stowaways in live seaweed that was used as packing material for either shipment of live bait worms or live seafood and improperly disposed of in San Francisco Bay. 1989 was the first confirmable detection, and following that, green crab were able to use their pelagic larval stage, which has a relatively, reasonably long dispersal phase of 30 to 75 days, temperature dependent, to spread primarily northward along the coast. And the spread periods are really accelerated by warm climatic events, particularly El Nino years. And in our recent years, we had a local atmospheric event called the Blob, which produced similar conditions, even in conjunction with El Ninos. So these really facilitated the spread, and their arrival in Washington was first noted in 1997-98. At the same time, they were showing up for the first time on Oregon and southern Vancouver Island in British Columbia. One thing, so from there, they've actually continued their iterative northward spread all the way up the coast of central BC and into southern southeast Alaska, which you'll hear Ian talk about next. But the one thing I want to point out is that initially during this range expansion, they apparently skipped over the Salish Sea, which is the inland waters of British Columbia and Washington entirely. And this is in part luck, but it's also in part a semi-permeable geographic barrier where there's westward surface water flow through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So this was an interesting dynamic, and in fact, they also didn't establish populations every time they were first noted in these places. We have some good data that they would show up on these warm years, and then their populations would drop. They weren't self-sustaining populations, particularly in Washington and Oregon. This was the status for several decades after the first detection, and that really sort of quieted down the concern that the state had about the risk to resources here. That changed in 2012 when green crabs were found on the BC side of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, just west of Victoria in a place called Souk Basin, which is indicated by the arrow there, or pretty close to it. And that reinvigorated concern that Washington had for whether green crabs might further expand their range into the Salish Sea and whether this could mark a change in the ongoing invasion. And as you heard Gabby mention, there's a number of threats that Washington has and had to be concerned about. Invasions play out differently everywhere they happen, so we don't know exactly what it's going to look like in our neck of the woods, but some of the specific impacts that we are concerned about include those mentioned in terms of predation on bivalves that are potentially damaging to a really valuable statewide shellfish industry. In addition, competing with or preying on very commercially valuable Dungeness crab, particularly at early life stages when they're size matched or in favor of green crabs preying on Dungeness crab. The impacts to eelgrass that have been observed on the East Coast are something we're watching with a lot of concern too, because that is, among other things, really important nursery habitat for not only Dungeness crab, but also salmonids, another really important, critical keystone fishery in our area. And the potential for their role as ecosystem engineers and burrowing to destabilize marsh banks has always been something that's on the table. And then, of course, all of these impacts ripple out into larger impacts through the food web, propagating through the food web and even to humans. So it's with all of these things in mind that Washington Sea Grant started a program to meet the state agency mandate to monitor for this species. And it was really intended to be a participatory science program that would engage community members in doing the early detection monitoring before we found evidence of green crab along the inland shorelines. So while we were still in that period of absence in the Salish Sea. The program was launched in 2015 as a pilot with 7 sites and very quickly grew to its present size, which is 58 or so monitoring sites across the Washington inland portion of inland waters. And I'll point out that there are another 10 to 12 sites in coastal estuaries that we've started since as well. But focusing first on the early detection network, the crab team program was designed to implement consistent effort with relatively rigorous and QA'd protocols, matching monitors with targeted sites based on geographic spread and range of, reach across the geography we wanted to cover, as well as specifically really getting folks to look at habitats that we thought were the most susceptible to green crabs at the early stages of invasion. It was designed to collect data on more than just green crabs, so we're looking for evidence of association and impacts through a before-after control impact design. And this level of monitor engagement really relies heavily on, it's I guess what we would call a high-touch effort, where we engage very heavily with monitors in terms of a great deal of training and ongoing continuing education and QA and community building that is required for the sustainability of their participation. This has led to a number of early detection successes, starting with the very first green crab that was captured and confirmed for Washington's inland shorelines in 2016 at one of the crab team monitoring sites that year. Since then, I'll fast forward to 2024 just to say that across the inland geography of Washington, the work has grown rapidly and the number of green crab sites with green crab detections has also increased. Here is a map of every place that was trapped in 2024, not just by crab team, but also by tribal and agency partners across the state. And the white circles are all of the places we trap and still don't find evidence of green crabs, while the red circles indicate a little bit of a proxy for relative abundance of green crabs. Now, of these sites, a fair number of them are sites at which the first detection was made through the crab team program. So there are some early detection successes that we have to point to. And if we were to sort of be a little bit more generous and expand the impact of the crab team program to include the training that we have done for agency staff, both through the crab team program and through other training programs, and the public outreach that has resulted in initial detections, this sort of list of these circles, yellow circles indicating program detections, is much larger. And from this, it's transitioned also to emphasizing the value of the monitoring efforts of community members. This is a data set that tracks green crab populations in a consistent way. I mentioned the coastal sites where green crabs, which weren't sites that functioned for early detection. We already knew green crabs might be living in those places, but those are sites where we are able, by doing this trapping in the same way in the same places over time, to actually compare changes over time in a more robust way than some of the opportunistic trapping efforts, which are necessary for intervention, enable us to do. So these are our network sites, our catch rate, which is a proxy for green crab abundance, and how it has shifted over time and across some of the larger coastal estuaries on the Pacific coastal sites, these white teardrops. The monitoring efforts are also super valuable for learning about the impact of change and these pocket estuary communities that are going to be monitored for green crab impacts. Even before we get to the impact stage, we're learning about what these relatively understudied communities, pulling together a paper looking at an anomalous marine heat wave, an atmospheric heat wave, and are in collaboration with some temperature data that we've been pulling, enables us to look really closely at what's going on in these, even even beyond green crabs. And this is all, data collected by volunteer monitors. So from this crab team effort, this was really set up on the sort of spectrum of community engagement to have high sensitivity for green crab, working to find them at the earliest stages of invasion. To a certain extent, however, being able to do that and that high engagement model really limited the scope of the program we were able to implement. And within the last few years, we took that information and really still saw a need to further expand the footprint of what community members could do in the green crab space. So we created a second program that complements the trapping program with a beach-based molt survey. This is relative to the trapping program, has a much lower barrier to participation. It's app-based data submission. The searches are opportunistic. It's a 20-minute walk. Trainings are provided in lots of different ways, and they're much shorter than the trainings that our trapping partners get. And the impact to our program staff is also somewhat more person efficient. So there is a trade-off here. On the left is our wide net that we're casting for green crab, and on the right is our deep bench. And what this has enabled us to provide to the state is, and I couldn't resist this ridiculous pun, of multiple tools in our toolkit. For instance, we know that green crabs are sometimes detected first through molts, and they're sometimes detected first through traps. And it's not the case that at all of our sites where we do both of these surveys that we always detect them in both methods. Therefore, this has led us to believe that having both of these complementary search modalities is really the most effective way to make sure we are even more sensitive for green crab. The other thing that we've learned by doing these things side by side is that we detect different sizes of green crabs through these methods. Even though we already are using multiple trap types in our trapping to target different sizes, we still are able to find smaller molts with greater frequency, which could give us an even better shot at early detection. So this molt search program has enabled us to scale up. On the left here is a map from the data records that show all of the surveys that have been submitted to date. We're getting real close to that 1,000 mark, hopefully hit that in the next couple months. And through a sort of a large scope of program, including a train the trainer approach, that we're just able to reach a lot of people in a very short amount of time. I'll also just point out that, I didn't start out as a participatory science person. I started out as an invasive species research, but I've sort of drank my own Kool-Aid or green crab whiskey, whatever. I've done both to really believe in the multiple benefits of community engagement. And I would say that building this program has resulted in a lot of transferable tools and knowledge about that has supported the West Coast effort at large. So the protocols can be translated to other geographies. It's not the case that the same program will work for everybody, but some of the tools that we've created have been useful. For instance, in the top right here, this is the Kachemak Bay NER in Homer, Alaska, where they are increasing their own community science involvement, and in doing so have taken some of what they've learned from how Crab Team does training and what the tools that we use to train folks are. We've also, in the bottom picture here, have worked with DFO to help launch their own community engagement monitoring network as well. Training trainers in this way also increases technical capacity. These folks are going to be asked questions by community members. And so in training folks, you give them way more information than they need to actually do the thing so that they can answer all the questions that they get as well. So that has technical capacity benefits as well. And then because everything has to be an iteration, I want to highlight that probably the biggest benefit is the retention and sustainability of the community engaged monitoring individuals. Some of these folks who are volunteers have been monitoring for longer than the managers working on this, and they know their spot really well. Their commitment to these places makes them long-term supporters and also public supporters for the visibility of an issue. So I will just thank all of those folks who contributed to this and look forward to answering your questions in the chat or after we hear from Ian.
Great, thank you, Emily. And again, all the questions in the chat. Gabby's been really typing away, answering your questions. So let's give Emily her turn to answer a bunch of questions as well. So moving up the coast to Alaska, like to introduce Ian Hudson. Ian is a tribal member of the Metlakatla Indian Community and works as a fisheries biologist and green crab coordinator for the Metlakatla Department of Fish and Wildlife, or has been working for the Department of Fish and Wildlife since 2024. Prior to working for the Metlakatla Indian Community, he worked at Metlakatla High School for the last 10 years, 6 of which he was a science teacher. And Ian's presentation is managing the first European green crab invasion in Alaska. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Tim. So good morning, everyone. My name is Ian Hudson. I work as the fisheries biologist and green crab coordinator for the Metlakatla Indian Community. This is kind of more of a recent event compared to the other 2 presentations that we've seen today. Some of the other important people in our department director, Dustin Winter, Nicole Reynolds, who is our data analysis, and Janelle Winter, who is our invasive species project director. So just a little bit of background on where we are in the state of Alaska. We are in the very southern southeast portion of it, and we are the only native reserve in the state of Alaska. And being the only native reserve gives us kind of a unique opportunity to manage our natural resources, both terrestrial and out to a 3,000-foot maritime border surrounding the island. We actually have the largest tribally managed hatchery and fishery in the United States. We have a community of roughly 1,500 community members right there in Metlakatla, as where most of the population lives. And we are just 15 miles south from Ketchikan, Alaska. I think this was very well covered by Gabby and Emily, so I'll just skip this. I will note that Gabby said that these are indestructible crabs, and I can fully attest that I have these in a classroom fish tank, and over winter break, the chiller stopped working and the tank was well over 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And upon returning to my classroom, I immediately chilled it back down to 42 degrees, and they were just as happy as they were. So they are incredibly durable. So here's kind of our invasion timeline in a nutshell. Once Haida Gwaii, which lies roughly 80 miles southwest of Annette Island, first detected green crab, the community really wanted to put some effort into building its capacity to do early detection monitoring. And so in 2020, by way of NOAA funding, we received our first funds in order to get supplies from Pacific States Marine Fishery Commission. The next year, we began surveying around the island. We received more funding from BIA to do so, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in 2022 is when our first detection of green crab on Annette Island was detected. And since then, we've had some other funding sources, such as Association of Native Americans. 2023 was another heavy trapping event. And then in 2024, which was my first summer dealing with green crabs, we discovered them off island in the state of Alaska's waters for the first time. And so that kind of changed some things. So the methods that we use are largely from all the work that Emily and Green Crab team and Washington Sea Grant has done prior. They have an excellent set of methods. It's massive, it's extensive. And so we kind of followed a lot of what they presented. And so we start with molt walks in areas that are either significant to cultural subsistence activities or that look like they're green crabby, kind of estuary environments. And so molt walks are a good way that you can cover a lot of ground and get some physical evidence if green crabs are present or not. We've also done lots of eDNA testing around the island. This is a little more involved than molt walks. There's a lot of protocols to go through in order to get good eDNA sampling. And if we have something confirmed from either molt walks or eDNA, we then move to prospect trapping, which is kind of smaller scale. We have completely moved to a 4-door ProMarsh shrimp trap and not so much fukuis anymore. And we found that the shrimp traps are a lot more durable and, in our eyes, more effective at catching crabs. And so once we deployed 20 traps in an area we found a carapace or in an area where we had an eDNA hit, we record every organism just to collect some baseline data on what is currently present in that area. If we get a live crab from there, we go into full-scale removal trapping, which is 30 plus traps. These are set in the water at all times. They are baited daily, and it's kind of more of an extensive trapping once we find the presence of a European green crab in an area. And for disposal methods, we get some data from each crab, we measure it, we look at the color, sex, and then we dispose of it by freezing and then bringing it to our community garden for being composted. So in 2021, this was the first year that we were really able to conduct any sort of baseline monitoring because of COVID and whatnot. It was just a challenge in 2020. And so this year we ended up sending around 66 samples of eDNA to the United States Army Corps of Engineers lab, and we did not have any positive detections for green crabs. In 2022, this was the first year. On July 19th, the first carapace was found on that island. So this is Tamgus Harbor. If I go back one slide, this is kind of in the southern portion of the island, and it has a south-facing entrance, which is kind of a theme in Southeast Alaska for green crab detections. And so after finding the first carapace, traps were immediately deployed, and the first 5 live crabs were found on July 26th. What's interesting for some of the data for this year is that our ratio of males to females was almost 1-to-1. And talking with Emily and some other people, we're not really sure why that is, or we haven't figured it out yet. But most of these crabs came out of Coast Guard Creek, which is on this southern part of this inlet in Tamgus Harbor. In 2023, trapping efforts continued. Notice that this year we had a 2-to-1 ratio male to female, so it was twice as many males this year as females, which is an interesting statistics. I don't really quite sure know what that means. But community members around all of Southeast Alaska started ramping up their development of community monitoring for green crab. And so there was an event in 2023 in April where it was kind of like that train the trainer workshop that Emily was just talking about. I believe she was actually here in Metlakatla for this workshop, but it included getting a bunch of people from different communities in Southeast Alaska all together to get hands-on experience on trapping and dealing with these crabs. Southeast Alaska is geographically large, but it is a pretty small, tight-knit community. Also in 2023, with some of the crabs that were captured, Carolyn Teapolt from Woods Hole came and did some genetic testing of the crabs that were caught on Annette Island. And what's interesting about this is that they likely came from 2 different population segments, one from Vancouver Island, one from the Haida Gwaii area, and also one from south in Washington. And so she suggested that the crab population came from multiple age classes and also multiple genetic sourcing, creating a crab that can potentially deal with even more drastic conditions. And as Emily showed the currents, but the trend is that they are continually moving north, and it's not like we can stop ocean currents from flowing and bringing these larval crabs into different and new areas. In 2024, this was my first year, but the top graph there is showing how many crabs were caught per day in 2024. And the bottom one is catch per unit effort. And so compared to the other years, these were actually much lower than we had seen in the previous 2 years. And so we had a single outlier event where I think my next slide shows it, but we found a new location where these crabs were in a very protected soft sediment salt chuck. And so if we eliminate this data from the trapping efforts that were done the previous 2 years, we actually saw a big reduction, like 75% less crabs caught in Tangas Harbor than the previous 2 years, which is showing that the efforts that we've been putting forth are indeed working to our knowledge. 63% of the crabs trapped this year were all from salt chuck. And notice that the ratio it went from 1-to-1 to 2-to-1 to 1.36. So it's interesting, the male to female ratios. On June 13th, this was actually my third day on the job. Ginny Eckert with Alaska Sea Grant, some college interns, and also some Metlakatla High School students who were interning with her. We took a trip to Boswick Inlet, which is just northwest of Annette Island or Metlakatla, and we conducted a molt walk. And on that day, we found 13 carapace, which resulted in a trapping effort by the Metlakatla Indian Community Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so we trapped for a week, and we actually didn't catch anything until a big rain event happened. And Boswick Inlet is this beautiful estuary, and the water level was high, and so it pushed our traps down almost a quarter mile. And the next day, after checking the moved pots, we had gotten our first green crab in Alaska state waters. And this resulted in a response from Tammy Davis and the Alaska Department of Fish and Wildlife, where they conducted 2 different rapid response trapping efforts in Bostwick Inlet. This is the salt chuck that I referred to before, kind of the big outlier for last year's data. This has a very small entrance, which is southern facing. And we conducted a molt walk, found 3 different carapace. And so we immediately set traps in there. Had a larger crab in one of the shrimp traps, but most of these were all caught by hand picking. And so these were very small, juvenile, probably young of the year, that were all just being protected in this bay that's very mucky, very soft. And so this very much skewed our numbers for the catch for this year. Between the September 4th and the 13th, we had live picked 883 green crab from the salt chuck. And mostly, I don't know if I can see my pointer, but where those 2 or those 3 dots are on the left side of the salt chuck is primarily where they were located in massive numbers. As the previous 2 presentations have emphasized, community outreach is a huge part of awareness for green crabs and what their potential is. And so on July 19th, which marked the first day that they were found in Alaska, our community has made that Green Crab Awareness Day. There's other communities in Southeast Alaska that have also been participating, such as Petersburg. And this is a great way to get community members in the door, getting outreach materials, molt walk sheets. We even cooked crabs. That's everyone's like first question when talking about green crabs. It's like, well, can you eat them? And, you know, compared to our native Dungeness crabs, they are more like a tapas meal. They taste really good, but it's a lot of effort to get a little bit of meat out. Our green crab logo was also developed by one of our high school students who is in the native art program. So all year recap, we've kind of already gotten over this, but if we look at the top graph, the blue line is the outlier, which was hand-picked crab. And so if we look at the blue line from 2024, it has much lower per day catch efforts than the previous 2 years. And so to us, this has indicated that the efforts that we've been putting forth are working. And The numbers of crabs that we have comparatively to even like say Haida Gwaii, we've only caught not even 4,400, and I think they're at well over 1 million now. So our efforts are much smaller scale than other ones, but we're hoping that by doing all this work as a department, we can keep the numbers to a level that's lower. As an ex-teacher, one thing I've been able to do is keep the high school students involved, both in Ketchikan and in Metlakatla. I reached out to Todd Gray from the Tulalip tribes, who invented this crab slab, which is essentially like a passive trapping device where it has an open door. Crabs can go in and out. You kind of stick it in the muddy areas. And we deployed these in the salt chuck after the high school kids made them in class, and I was able to take them out. And they actually they catch crabs. So it's kind of a safer way. Instead of leaving pots out there for extended periods of time, organisms can go in and out. So thank you to Todd Gray for allowing us to use that design. The K-High National Ocean Science Bowl team came over for a day and got some hands-on experience trapping green crab. Their final paper that they were doing for the state competition was actually on European green crabs, and I believe they actually won the state competition with that paper, so kudos to them. So these are some concerns. There's a website called shorezone.org, and this shows all of the vulnerable areas that could potentially lead to green crab invasions. And the tricky part about Southeast Alaska is how remote it is. From the Star to the southern tip of Prince of Wales, that's roughly 30 miles, and that's a largely uninhabited area. And so although there's only been detections of live crabs on Annette Island and Gravina Island, much of these other areas are not being monitored. And so concerns moving forward, it only took 2 years for crabs to get 80 miles from Haida Gwaii to Annette Island in that area. And if we look at Annette Island to Seattle, it's roughly the same distance from Annette Island to Cordova, Alaska, which is another community that has ideal habitat for green crabs. And so the more awareness that's raised within the community of Southeast Alaska, the better. And we've been trying to build as many partnerships as we can to allow for all these different communities to help each other and go over best practices and to work as a team to combat this invasive species. So some of our next projects coming up, we did a research proposal for telemetry and stomach content analysis, and it was funded by the BIA. And so we're really excited to keep moving our understanding of green crabs forward, knowing what their daily movements are, knowing what their diet is, examining our eelgrass beds to see what degradation has occurred, are all things that we need to take into account. And I think it will allow us to continue to know more about these. Just a shout out to all of our technicians and people that are involved in the day-to-day trapping for the last several years. I've only been here since 2014, but the list of names up there are our technicians and interns. And without them, this whole entire effort would not be possible. So thank you to all of our partners, and thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ian. Give people a few minutes to think up those questions and go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I think there's some great questions that have already been answered. I'm partial to the one about invasive species markets, so check that one out. But while we're giving people time to answer and think of questions, I just wanted to thank our presenters. Thank you all for attending today. A question for our presenters. Wondering if, well, it was great to hear about all of the great work you're doing with your communities, and I'd be interested, and hopefully everyone else would be interested too, in hearing if you have any stories outside of what you presented today, where the work that you're doing with your communities, like, clearly had an impact on somebody, like a good feel-good story, because those are always great. So I don't know if, you know, like Gabby, you have a story about how like your work's impacted a business, or out west we've been able to help communities feel like they have agency in this issue?
Yeah, I guess I'll take a stab at that one. I think probably what has been the most exciting is when I first started this, I didn't think that, it would turn into a 10-year-long project, or that people would actually quit their day jobs and start a whole new business. And we actually do have, I think that's our biggest success story, other than the crab whiskey, is that this high school biology teacher and I started working together because he was using green crabs as a way, to get the kids out in the field and to look at invasive species and, all that stuff. And the more he learned about the stuff that I was doing, the more questions he asked, and the more he saw potential in actually turning this into a viable business. And he's doing it. It's not huge, but he is providing soft shell green crabs to area restaurants. He's, providing green crabs as bait for recreational tautog fishery, in New England. And, now he's trying his hand at an oyster farm in southern Maine. So he's also been such a great ambassador for not only sort of just biology and green crab information and spreading the word on what we do in general for Sea Grant, but also just, trying to get people to eat them and ask for them and so on. So, he's stuck with it and he's making it work. So I think that's pretty fun.
I think here in Washington, there's a couple of things that I've really liked to have seen over the last decade. One of which is the community of trapping practitioners, I'll call them. So has grown and sort of really coalesced. So folks who either started trapping green crab with the community monitoring program with Crab Team, or they started as an intern with one of our partner agencies, ultimately have stayed in the game and throughout their career and moved on to become technicians, or just, it's been like a real professional development thing. And that only benefits the issue because these are folks who have seen the history of the invasion unfold, and they also have the technical expertise that they've been accumulating over that time. So that's one of the stories that I like about the community that's grown in addition to the actual community monitors.
Well, I guess I'll say that over the last 2 or 3 years, the department's hired high school student interns to do kind of the everyday trapping and removal, and just the ability of those students to pick up how to ID the green crabs versus all the native crabs so quickly and efficiently. They become so good at it, and I think if they're utilized in more ways during that trapping season in different communities, I think they're a huge asset to the other, because they got the young eyes. And they can also then, they go home, their parents ask them how their day was, they tell them what they did, and then it becomes kind of a compounding effect of community awareness.
Thanks for those stories. It's nice to end the depressing topic of invasion science on good, positive things. So I'll give our speakers a few more minutes to work on what's in the chat. Some of the questions are a little bit more on the detail of some of the research and other science related to green crab management. At some point in time in the future, we'll have another webinar on some of the more, I guess, recent green crab science and research, so stay tuned for that. And I know Tegan has a few things to share with you all to wrap up on behalf of NASMAR.
I wanted to thank all of our speakers so much for joining us today, and thank you, Tim, for helping organize this. And then I do have just a couple slides. Also, a note that we will be sending any remaining questions to the speakers to respond to after the event if needed. So we do offer these free monthly webinars each month. So I wanted to show you our next two coming up. We were able to reschedule a webinar that was supposed to be held in December for March 19th on the Canadian biocontrol experience. And then in April, we'll be highlighting the spotted lanternfly as part of our Know Your Invasives campaign. So we hope that you can join us for those webinars. We'll be hosting the 2025 National Forum on Biological Control, and that will be in Annapolis, Maryland from April 14th through the 17th. The meeting themes revolve around biocontrol research, management, and impacts in natural areas. And we have some great speakers lined up. So I encourage you to register today if you're interested in networking in person with members of the biocontrol community. And then again, we do have NISA coming up next week. So I encourage you to sign up for some webinars. I look forward to seeing you then. And so thank you all for joining us today. And we will have this webinar posted on NASMA's YouTube channel, hopefully sometime next week. And so you can watch that there. But thank you all so much for joining us.